A few months ago, I started having a video debate with a guy named Potholer who had made some utterly ludicrous assertions in his videos.
Well, one thing's true, we were having a great debate. And I'm very happy to link the debate in the video description so you can judge for yourselves. Tony opened the debate by making these claims, which I listed in my opening response. And then I provided clear evidence that disproved each and every one, either by checking Tony's sources and how he misread them, or showing things that he claimed didn't exist, or challenging his misquotes by asking for video clips that he couldn't provide, or contradicting his claims with actual facts and figures, which is how science debates are supposed to work. After only 3 rounds of this, Tony refused to continue. So I'm delighted to see that 8 months on, he's finally rejoined the debate. A week before I was due to fly home, in fact, so he's just in time. I got back a couple of days ago, so I can now post my response. So let's take a look at his latest rebuttal.
Here's what he said in his silly BBC accent.
Hold on, as I've said before, personal insults aren't helpful, and they don't shed any light on who's correctly reporting the facts. I'm going to maintain this debate as a debate about science, not who can produce the most offensive personal insult. But before we go on to what I actually said, let's start with what Tony claims I said, using illustrations from my video that address the point he's making.
So Potholer's argument boils down to the idea that a little tiny nudge caused by changes in orbital cycles starts and ends ice ages.
Tony's misquote is what's known as a straw man. Invent something completely ridiculous, claim the other person said it, and then masterfully demolish it. So let's go with what I actually said, rather than what Tony wishes I'd said. I said that regular orbital cycles cause a small change in insolation, and this starts a process called positive feedback, causing strong warming or cooling. That again is not my theory, it's the conclusion of scientific research that I've cited. I'm happy with that being characterized as a tiny nudge, as long as it's understood that the tiny nudge is a change in insolation. But I never said that a tiny nudge stops this process. As I explained, warming or cooling is stopped because feedback is less than 1, so positive feedback gets weaker and weaker, until finally the amount of energy leaving the Earth equals the amount coming in.
But then he says you start getting feedbacks caused by carbon dioxide and methane being released from the ground.
Yes, I did actually say that. I think that's the only quote Tony's got right in his entire rebuttal. The reason I said that is because that's the conclusion of scientific research. And of course I backed it up by citing scientific studies.
And this starts accelerating it faster and faster until it comes, as he described it, crashing into the ground.
But of course I never said that any of these glacial cycles come crashing into the ground. How's that even possible? He seems to be mixing up 2 completely different things. I used this very simple illustration in one of my videos to explain the principle of positive feedback, using the example of a balance with a rolling weight. In this example, positive feedback brings the plank crashing to the ground because the feedback is greater than 1. In other words, even after the initial forcing stops, the tilting continues and accelerates. In the example of feedback in glacial cycles, I explained that once the initial forcing stops, positive feedback doesn't get faster and faster and lead to runaway warming because feedback is less than 1. I can list the differences very clearly in this graphic, so hopefully they won't get mixed up again in Tony's next rebuttal.
But he never explains what crashing into the ground means.
Okay, well, crashing to the ground means that the plank of wood crashes into the ground.
Crashing into the ground implies that a very strong force stopped a runaway feedback effect.
It was stopped by the ground.
He wants you to believe that a tiny nudge from orbital cycles starts...
Hang on, now Tony's talking about orbital cycles. So let's switch to that subject and start that again.
He wants you to believe that a tiny nudge from orbital cycles starts and stops ice ages.
Just to repeat, a tiny nudge from orbital cycles doesn't stop ice ages. I never said a tiny nudge stops ice ages. I don't want anyone to believe a tiny nudge stops ice ages.
But he also wants you to believe that there's some very strong and completely undefined force which stops this runaway feedback effect.
Just to repeat, the Earth did not experience runaway feedback during glacial cycles because feedback is less than 1. Therefore, a strong and undefined force does not stop this non-existent runaway feedback. I never said a strong force stops this non-existent runaway feedback, and I don't want people to believe a strong force stops this non-existent runaway feedback. None of this nonsense about forces stopping runaway feedback and nudges stopping ice ages is anywhere in the scientific literature or in my videos. I'm obviously going to have to explain this again, but this time I'll write it down. Firstly, changes in orbital cycles cause changes in insolation, increasing warming in a crucial part of the Earth. This triggers feedbacks that amplify the warming. Because the Earth's climate feedback is less than 1, the feedback effect gets less and less over time. Think of an echo that bounces around a canyon. The increase in the Earth's temperature therefore continues at a smaller and smaller rate until the amount of energy leaving the Earth equals the amount coming in. The Earth then stabilizes at this new, higher temperature called the equilibrium temperature. It's now in an interglacial. It remains in the interglacial state for thousands of years until orbital cycles change insolation in the opposite direction, cooling the Earth, amplified by positive feedback, and the Earth enters another glacial period.
And once the teeter-totter is completely whacked out...
Just a sec, Tony's now talking about the teeter-totter again, so let's get back to that.
And once the teeter-totter is completely whacked out and crashed into the ground like this, how did it get back in balance? He didn't make any attempt to explain that.
Sorry, in that case I'll explain how a teeter-totter defies the law of gravity, picks itself up off the ground and gets back into balance. The answer is on the screen.
So here's my experiment I want him to try. He should put a 300-pound guy on one side with the teeter-totter, get it in balance, then give him a little nudge, and as the teeter-totter accelerates faster and faster towards the ground, he should stick his little pinky finger between the end of the teeter-totter and the ground and give it a tiny little nudge up to stop the motion downward. Then he can report back to us about how that worked out.
The answer is that your hand would get crushed. I'm not sure what the point is, except don't put your hand under a teeter-totter if a fat guy sits on it.
His argument is totally ambiguous gibberish and completely scientifically unsupportable.
Great, then we have a very clear difference of fact, which is what makes the perfect science debate. I say that my explanation of what causes glaciations and the figures I gave for methane are an accurate reporting of the science. You say they aren't. So all we have to do is check the science journals. Since I've been willing to answer all your questions, let's nail you down on my questions. Do you now understand the difference between a teeter-totter and a glacial cycle? If you disagree with any of them, please say which ones you disagree with and why. I've explained during this debate how the Earth's climate feedback systems diminish once the initial forcing stops, until outgoing radiation matches incoming radiation and the Earth stabilizes at a new equilibrium temperature. This is what the science says, so have I misrepresented the science, and if so, how? Do you disagree with the figures I gave for the half-life of methane, methane's global warming potential, and the changes in atmospheric methane concentration over the last 40 years? If so, please give what you think are the correct figures and cite your sources, just as I've done. If it's time-consuming for you to make videos and you just prefer to talk into a camera and give your information and your sources verbally, that's fine. You say you'd rather give your presentation live. That's fine too. Please do it live. Let everyone know what time you're going to give your rebuttal, and everyone can watch it live. But I'm still going to fact-check your claims however you present them, because there's no escaping fact-checking in a science debate. As we've seen, you make mistakes. I'm happy to put this down to a faulty memory or a misreading of the scientific studies you sometimes cite, which are the kind of errors we all make. But that's why I fact-check all your claims, and I expect you to fact-check mine. See if you can find something I've got wrong. We're not here just to shout at each other, talk past each other, throw insults and make things up as we go along. Science debates aren't about declaring yourself the winner, as you put it in yet another made-up quote, Tony. It's about establishing who's got his facts right and who's wrong. Getting to the truth makes both of us winners. And presenting evidence to support an assertion or disprove someone's spurious claim isn't digging in heels, it's how we separate fact from fiction. Of course, you can make your next rebuttal another round of personal insults if you really want to, but I think most people would like to see a debate where we bring facts and figures to the table, compare them, cite our sources, and fact-check to get to the bottom of who's right and who's wrong. Don't you agree?